So I am Mary Potter Kenyon, and this is our Writing to Help Others. I'm the program coordinator at Shalom Spirituality Center. I want to welcome you tonight and into this program about why would we share some of our personal writing. Some of you were here 2 weeks ago. I'm going to just do a little recap of what that was about in case you missed it. And for those of you who are already there, it's just a little reiteration of why would we write for ourselves. So a couple weeks ago, we talked about expressive writing and what it can do for us in a healing way. And Dr. Ira Progoff, we talked about in the 1960s, he was doing these kinds of journaling for his clients. He's a psychotherapist. And so it's nothing new, writing for yourself, journaling, diarying, using diaries. None of that is new to any of us. But if you talk about expressive writing, you will most often hear the name Dr. James Pennebaker. And he, in the 1990s, started studying what journal writing and expressive writing can do for us, for ourselves. And there's a whole science about it, and that's what we talked about a couple weeks ago. There's a whole science behind the fact that journaling or doing expressive writing, and what I mean by that is that's very personal writing that you are doing for yourself. That there's a whole science behind that being health benefits for you, emotional benefits for you. And we talked too about writing about the bad stuff, writing about the good stuff too, because it is helpful for you to work through some things through your journaling or through your writing. And why would you want to write about some of that stuff that's not so pleasant? We discussed something called cellular memory. And if you have your handout, I wrote that down so you can look it up later if you're interested in that. And cellular memory, I will show you an example later of what can happen to us if we don't work through some of the stuff that we're going through right now, or anytime in our life. If we lose a job, if we lose an important person in our life, if we go through something very unpleasant in our life and we just want to forget about it, well, our bodies hold a memory of all of those things, each cell in our body. And I still am fascinated by this. I'm not a scientist by any means, but when I realized that every cell in my body holds on to a memory, and that's why when we write our way through something, we can work our way through something. And it's a cheap and inexpensive way to work our way through something. So if you're not journaling now through the pandemic, it's something that you might want to try. It's a cheap, inexpensive way of working through some things in your life. So when we're talking about this personal writing, why would we ever share any of that personal writing, share pieces of our diary or pieces of our journals or pieces of this very personal writing? If you have your handout, I wrote a little saying by Robert Ingersoll, "We rise by lifting others." And this is what I truly believe, and there's science behind this, is when we share some of these personal things, share our stories, share what we've been through, we can help somebody else who's behind us in their journey. And I listed 2 Bible verses that really hit home with me and really explained this. And one is 2 Corinthians 1:3-4. "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God." And so if we look at that Bible verse and think about some of the things we have been through that maybe somebody else hasn't, when they are facing something like that, our stories can help them. Our words can help them. And I believe we are all here to help each other home. And by that I mean we are all here to help each other down those rocky paths through stuff like what we're going through right now, through loss or whatever we've been through. And so that might be why we end up sharing some of these personal things, either through a blog or a video or a podcast or a book or an essay or a devotion or an article. There are so many different ways that we can share our stories, or in person, that our stories might be able to help somebody else. And another Bible verse that I put on your handout, and if you don't have your handout with you and you need it or you can't find it, I can send it to you after this class. Ecclesiastes 4:9-10. Two are better than one, because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. And sometimes when you're going through something, if you're a reader like I am, the only way you're not going to feel alone in whatever it is you're going through is to read a book or an article or an essay or something by somebody who's gone through the same thing. And we're all going through all of this together, right? And it doesn't have to be the bad stuff that you're sharing. The writing to entertain has its place too. I can't tell you how many funny videos or funny shows. I turn to comedy every night, whether it's something fun. I mean, things that are actually ridiculous that I share with my kids, and they say, why do you think that's funny? There's certain comedians that are doing little videos. There's singers that are doing free singing at night in their homes. There's just, that helps me. So somebody's lighthearted, funny story can help us through a time like this. So it doesn't have to be all the bad stuff that we share. It can be something that's just there for entertainment, because I don't know, there's certain kinds of books that I'm not reading right now. I am reading light and fluffy and even chick lit books that I wouldn't normally read. And so if that's the kind of stuff that you end up wanting to write, if you have a sense of humor and you can share that, that's helping other people through stuff. So that's why we would maybe consider sharing some of our personal writing. So one question would be, how do we know if any of that personal writing that we are doing, any of the journaling that we might be doing, is meant to be shared? How would we know that? I mean, how would God or the Holy Spirit let us know that we can help somebody else with our own writing? And on the handout, I have a few ideas for how we might be able to know that. And one would be that sharing your story could help somebody else. Sharing your story, whether verbally or written, could help somebody else. I know someone who approached me and asked for help in getting her journals published that she started writing after her daughter committed suicide. And she had 3 journals filled with what it was to face the suicide of a child. And I asked her if she had edited it or had somebody look at it yet to see if it's publishable. And she answered, I can't even look at it. I just want somebody to take them and publish them, and then I can take them to places when I go and speak. And I said, but if you want to get these journals published, you have to edit them. I mean, you can't just put, what good would it do to share all the pain and all the anguish and everything that you can't even look at if you don't even know what else is in there? Is there hope in there? Is somebody reading it going to see some hope? Are they going to see some light at the end of these 3 journals? So I'm not being mean if I tell somebody like that, this writing might have been just for you. It doesn't mean that maybe pieces of it couldn't help somebody else through this, pieces of your story. But sometimes we're asked to write just for ourselves. And by that I mean, yes, our experience, the writing is helping us, and that's what we have to figure out. Okay, if this is something that should be shared or I would like to get published, then we have to realize that there's going to be some editing going on with that writing. Our story, that's one of the things I mentioned, our story better have some hope in it, or why would we share that? Our story, I hope, would have some redemption in it. Is there something in your story that would help other people? Then maybe that would be a good time to share some of that writing. So we have to make these kinds of decisions as we're doing our first of all, if we're writing for ourselves and just for ourselves, that's wonderful. We're getting something out of that. We can burn it if we want to. If we just write it, it helped us. We can maybe look at it later, and that's what I do, is I keep my journals. And I have pulled things out of those journals, though, to help other people. So it's partly discernment of some of these very, very personal things that we have to be transparent. We can't hide behind some of these very personal things and make it look like our life is perfect or we're not helping anybody. So that's another thing we want to look at. Are you feeling a call? Are you feeling that maybe this is a story that God wants you to share? So it's partful prayerful discernment and acknowledging that if I'm being led to share this with the world, I have to know that publishing it there's a business into that, and it's going to be edited, it's going to be cleaned up, yes, it's our very personal, very close thoughts, but if we want it published, it's going to be edited. So that's another thing we want to look at. Could your story make a difference in somebody's life? That's something you want to discern. Do you have confirmation from other people or from somebody in the publishing business? Or has somebody heard your story and it helped them? And they think, or they have said, you should write a book about this. This would be a good book. That's something for you to look at, is, okay, as hard as it might be to share some of that personal stuff, if people are telling me it's helping them to hear my story, I can help other people with this story. And you don't want to have an agenda, a hidden agenda to get something published, like revenge. And I've done this myself. So the very first copy, or the very first manuscript I wrote about taking care of my husband during his cancer journey, because I was thinking, there's no book here when my husband's diagnosed with cancer that the person doesn't die at the end that they're taking care of. I want there to be a book out there that the person doesn't die at the end. But I will tell you that the first version of that book did actually name a horrible doctor. I don't think I used his name, but it named the hospital. It named pretty much anybody could have figured out who that awful, horrible doctor was in this nonfiction memoir book. And thankfully, by the time I had a publisher interested, I could see that I can't name this person. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. I have to hide who this person is, because I just was so angry that I wanted to get back at him. So I know somebody else, another person who wanted to write about the abuse she received at the hands of her husband. Yes, she was going to change her name. And yes, she was going to self-publish. But I warned her to be very careful, because I could tell she was writing it to get back at him. She wanted everybody to know what a jerk he was. And so I asked her to be very careful, to hide, different things to make it so it would be really hard to figure out who this person was. But then she went out to stores in the area asking in public, would you take my book? And anybody could have figured out who this person was. So we have to be careful when we are publishing our private personal thoughts, because our stories include other people. And so we want to be careful of our motives. We want our motive to be to help other people, not to get back at somebody, not to reveal some secret, So there's that we have to think about too. So as you're thinking about those things, I want to thank, I'm going to share my screen, but I want to thank, well, first of all, do you have any questions? Because I can unmute you before I go any farther. I'm going to unmute you. Does anybody have any questions of anything I talked about so far? You are actually all unmuted. Maybe some of you know how to mute yourself, so some of you are muted. But you can also hold up your hand if you have a question. Okay, don't see somebody. So I'm muting you again, and I'm sharing my screen. Just someone, Sherry, one of the Sherrys, and Sharon shared this with me today, and it just really hit home for me, so I'm going to share it with you. And now I have to go get this book, and I don't know if you can see the whole screen. I can't see the whole screen on mine, but this is not on your handout because it was shared with me late in the day, but it just made so much sense about why we might be led to write, even if we're not comfortable with that idea of sharing some of our writing. If you were meant to cure cancer or write a symphony or crack cold fusion and you don't do it, you not only hurt yourself, you even destroy yourself. You hurt your children, you hurt me, you hurt the planet. You shame the angels who watch over you, and you spite the Almighty who created you and only you with your unique, I can't see the whole thing, the whole sole purpose of nudging the human race 1 millimeter farther along its path back to God. I can send this to you after this class if you want it. Creative work is not a selfish act or a bid for attention. I want you to remember that. Because if you have something in you and your story and you think, well, it's just my story and why would anybody care about my story, but you're feeling led to write about your story and you, it's not about you. It is not about you. It's a gift to the world and every being in it. Do not cheat us of your contribution. Give us what you've got. It's about God. If he is leading you to do this creative work and to share your story, it is no longer about you. It's not, you're not being, it's not being selfish to share your story if you are sharing it to help other people. So here's an example of why I would share, and my kids do not understand, and they roll their eyes about why mom would share this hideous, horrible picture of herself on a blog when I ended up in an emergency room around March. So my husband had passed away in March. My grandson's cancer had come back in March. So March is usually not a great month for me, but sometimes I just make myself really busy and I do a lot of things during that month and I think I'm okay. So when I was not okay and I ended up in the emergency room thinking that I was having a heart attack, and this was the third or the fourth time that I ended up in an emergency room within 7 years after my husband's death. And I had learned about that cellular memory. I looked at the dates of those emergency room visits, and sure enough, they were within 30 days of my husband's hospitalization and his heart attack. So the reason I shared this was not to show this beautiful picture of me in the emergency room, but to share this story of what can happen to us if we think we're okay, but our body's remembering something. And so this last paragraph of this blog post, 7 years after the March we discovered our little Jacob, my grandson's cancer had returned. 7 years after the month my husband had a heart attack and stent surgery. 7 years after the March my husband died. 7 years with a job I love and many exciting things happening in my life, my body still remembers. And I cannot tell you how many emails or how many responses I got from people who said, I didn't know that. I didn't know that there's this thing called cellular memory, and I wondered why I have headaches during this month, or I wondered why I always have stomach upsets during this certain time of year, and thank you. So that's why I would share something personal like that. And I'm not going to put a pretty picture up there because I didn't look pretty sitting in that emergency room all by myself, sad and not knowing what's wrong and kind of knowing what's wrong, but maybe it's not that. Maybe this time it's real because someday it might be real. And, you know, so that's reality. And we don't need to see those perfect Facebook pictures to share and see everybody's perfect family and perfect life. We need to be more real with each other, and we can do that in our writing. So here are a couple anthologies that actually included pieces of either my blog or my journal. So the Grief Diaries, Poetry and Prose included pieces of my journal. So I had little pieces of, just a paragraph or two, and then a poem, and then a blog entry. And So Long was actually an anthology of loss and remembrance. And you can see, I just liked having my mom's picture in a book. So I had it was pieces of my blog after my mother died. So we can't always find markets like this where we could have some of our pieces of writing, but every once in a while, pieces of our blog, pieces of our journal, a poem we wrote during a tough time, we could maybe help other people by sharing that. And so my Refined by Fire book originally started with a very happy, wonderful, beautiful scene, a true scene at my kitchen table of when my husband was reading the newspaper. I was writing. He kept getting me a new cup of tea or a new cup of coffee and bringing it to me. And I had not washed my hair. I was wearing my pajamas. And he looked over. I mean, I could feel him looking at me. And he just was looking at me with such love. And our marriage had become so different after cancer that we were true partners in life. He was just looking at me and he says, and I said, what? And he said, you're beautiful. And I knew he wasn't seeing the messy hair and the pajamas and the unwashed face and no makeup. He was seeing the person he had married. So that beautiful scene started up the book. But then I thought about, well, somebody picking up that book and maybe not having quite that marriage, because I didn't have that marriage 5.5 years before that, might put it back down because their marriage wasn't that perfect. And there's a lot of complications in our relationships and stuff. So I thought, when would they pick up that book? They might pick up that book about 10 weeks out, when you're kind of coming out of the fog. So I went to my journal about 10 weeks out, and I actually published my journal entry, which isn't the pretty kitchen scene. It's when it was dawning on me that I was never going to be loved like that again. Like, I was never going to have that again. And that I was crying in the peanut butter aisle at the store. And I'd cry at the ATM. And my daughter, who I picked up from a Bible camp, yelled at me because we couldn't find her t-shirt she'd made. And she said, I hate you. She screamed in front of people that she hated me. She actually said she wished I had died. I mean, it was just, that's not pretty. But by sharing that, by letting people know that I was crying in the peanut butter aisle at 10.5 weeks after my husband's death, what is that going to do for them when they're crying in the coffee aisle, or they're slamming their fists against the car steering wheel in a parking lot? They're going to think, oh, maybe I'm not crazy. Maybe this is what grief is. Maybe this is normal, or my child screaming at me. Maybe this is all normal. So that's why I would share something that personal. And I didn't have to try to remember what it felt like at 10.5 weeks. I had it right there in a piece of writing in a journal. So that's why I would share something that personal, is because that's reality. That's what it was like at 10.5 weeks. So one of the personal diary writings that you might be most familiar with, that we probably all were required to read in high school, was Anne Frank's diary. So we have a diary, an entire diary that's published. And what does that do for us? It gives us a piece of history. It lets us know what this young girl was thinking during this time. It gives us a glimpse into another human being in their life. Some others that you might be familiar with, the C.S. Lewis. Probably most of you have heard of his A Grief Observed. Madeleine L'Engle, you might think more of her Wrinkle in Time, but she has also published a set of journals called the Crosswick series that I love. So C.S. Lewis, when he journaled after his wife died and he had these doubts of faith, and he actually never used her name in his journal. He didn't call her by name in his journal. It was too painful. So he talked about what it was like in those early days of grief and his doubts. And now his book, I mean, it's so popular, you'll often hear it. So when he first allowed it to be published, it was not under his name. And then he eventually saw what I'm trying to tell you is that we need to be able to stand behind our words and share our stories. And I don't know if in later editions that they used her name, Joy. In Two-Part Invention, Mentally Angle wrote about losing her husband to cancer. So her journal was a lot about marriage and relationship and grief. And she has another journal in the Crossbook series about her grandmother or her great-grandmother and dying. And there's just, so what can we get from these two different kinds of books is we can share their story and maybe see somebody having gone through something that we are going through. Fly a Little Higher, I believe this is being made into a movie. That's the last I had heard. And when her son was dying of cancer, she was journaling. So you can see in the book, I took a little excerpt that she actually included journal entries in her book. So she's telling her son's story. Her son will always live on in her story and in his music and in a movie, but she's willing to share very personal writing about what it was to watch a son die of cancer. Here's a few that are not about cancer. One of them is about death. The Toast one by Roger Rosenblatt. Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant? Roz did her memoir in cartoon form, drawing about caregiving for her parents and watching her parents get older and being humorous about it, but sharing the real life stuff. That's the hard stuff about watching your parents get older and doing some caregiving. My Life with Asperger's, Look Me in the Eye, again. So these are very personal writing that has been published that is meant to help. And Roz does it in a way that makes us laugh. And so we can write about some of the stuff that we have experienced, or some of our personal writing can be humorous. It can be funny. It can be educational. It can be very sad. And just like when you watch hoarders shows, you're probably not a hoarder, although I did have somebody hold up their hand and say, yeah, I am. And that's why I watch it. But you're getting a glimpse into a life so that you can understand it better. And so that might be another reason you would be willing to share some of your writing, is because there might be things in your life that people just don't understand. And so you can give them some understanding by sharing some of your writing with them. And here's a couple of books written by, they're like a journal. They're like written as a journal. Both these people were dying. The Bright Hour, Nina, I can't see her last name, but and When Breath Becomes Air, he was dying. So these two people, and they didn't know each other, were both dying and wrote, and Nina had young children. I believe Paul had young children too. Later, after they passed away, and some television shows brought the two, because their books were so similar, the two spouses who had lost their spouse on air, when they brought them on air, eventually these two people fell in love. I mean, so by willing to share their spouse's story, or their spouse to share their story, it's not a pleasant topic, but we are all going to die, and it gives us a glimpse into living while you're dying, living while you're here. So both those authors, there's hope in those. There's hope in that. Yes, we know they die at the end, but their outlook on life and how they're handling it and how they're sharing it with their spouse, and it's, I would say these are uplifting books, which is not the subject you would necessarily think of as uplifting. So those are some different examples of writing that's personal, that's been published. Before I get into markets, and I already talked a little bit about the ethics of that, I want to know if any of you have any questions or comments, if you read some books that maybe were journals or diaries, or if you have a burning urge inside yourself to share some of your very personal writings? Any questions about that?
Mary?
Yes.